situated within the treaty territories of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and the Williams Treaty of 1923, and we're located on Anishinaabe territory. Our organization under UNESCO acknowledges the rights of Indigenous peoples in this territory and works toward respectful and reciprocal relationships. We are all caretakers of the land, and it is our duty as settlers in this area to educate ourselves on our responsibilities as laid out in these treaties. And at GBB, we are on a journey of learning more about the history of this region and about our responsibilities. So the agenda for this morning is shown here on the screen, and I apologize, I'm using two screens, so I'm going to be sort of looking away. We're going to start with a welcome and introduction to life on the Bay, what kind of brought us all here. And then, as I mentioned, we have a fantastic lineup of very knowledgeable speakers. So we'll start with the topic of shorelines and native plants with Julia Sutton from Sweetfern Consulting, followed by a talk on forest pests and diseases from Margaret Scott with Westwind Forest Stewardship. We will have a 15-minute break at that point, and then we will continue with presentations with Danielle Ward from Adams Brothers speaking on septic system health. And finally, lowering your energy bill with Benjamin John, energy and emissions specialist, before we wrap things up. So, just to get started here, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve. So some folks joining us today are likely aware that the Georgian Bay Biosphere is one of many regions around the world designated by UNESCO as a World Biosphere Reserve. In all, there are over 700 World Biosphere Reserves in more than 130 countries all across the world, including 19 in Canada and 4 here in Ontario. Our biosphere, the Georgian Bay Minidoka-Gami Biosphere, was designated in 2004. This designation recognizes our region as having global ecological significance, where people are inspired to live and work in harmony with nature. The biosphere encompasses the eastern coast of Georgian Bay and is situated within Anishinaabe territory, and is well known for having the largest collection of freshwater islands in the world, and is home to rare species and their habitats. Not only is the biosphere a set of lines on a map, it's also a registered charity with a mission to nurture that balance between people and nature. For those of you who have been aware of the biosphere for several years, you will notice that we've dropped the word reserve from our name. So in 2020, our name was officially changed to the Georgian Bay Biosphere, or GBB for short. You'll still see the R in our website and our emails, and working towards changing that. But there's a great article describing the reasons for this change on the news page of our website. And if you haven't read it or haven't learned about the reasons behind this change, it's a great story to get you up to speed. Shown here on the screen are the pillars of our biosphere, and all biospheres around the world for that matter. Each biosphere region works in these areas in ways that are relevant to their environments and to their communities. So in our region, this work looks like supporting land-based learning for Indigenous youth. Shown here in the photo are the G-Bay, or Georgian Bay Anishinaabe youth, who in October 2019 spent 19 very intensive days building a wigwas jimon, or birch bark canoe. Seen here, this is Oshkinigig, that's the name given to the wigwas jimon. This work also looks like providing educational opportunities for area schools. Pictured here is the Georgian Bay Water Festival, which is held each year at Kilburn Provincial Park for over 100 grade 4, 5, and 6 students, with the help of 35 to 40 high school students. And I just want to give a really big shout out to this program. It's been running for 12 years and involves 16 partners and schools, has involved 1,800 students and 360 high school volunteers. So a really, really impressive, long-standing program. This work also looks like promoting sustainable food systems through community gardens, like this brand new, beautiful garden in Port Severn, along with many others, including community gardens in the Parry Sound area. It also includes leading on species at risk projects. If you've seen our social media over the past couple of years, you will no doubt have seen the most adorable turtle hatchling photos that are a large part, or sorry, part of the large mitigation project. And working with numerous partners along the coast to take action against climate change through IceCap, or the Integrated Community Energy and Climate Action Plans. It also looks like putting shovels in the ground, creating new pollinator habitat like this pollinator patch in Point O'Barrel, with many more like it up and down the coast of Eastern Georgian Bay. This one was obviously pre-pandemic, but GBB is also involved in leading stewardship workshops, including this one on bats in the biosphere region, which involved building bat boxes and learning about bats for, and participants were able to take these home. And of course, our work also involves creating resources for those in the region to learn how to become better caretakers of the land and water. So Life on the Bay, which again is what has brought us all here today, is a self-assessment tool designed to help home and cottage owners interested in increasing their stewardship impact and decreasing their ecological footprint. The first edition of the Life on the Bay guide was published in 2009, and it was modeled after similar stewardship guides made for other areas of the province, like other parts of Lake Huron and Lake Simcoe. Our Life on the Bay guide is an adaptation of those other guides with our local context in mind. The guide features chapters on a wide range of topics, including how to live alongside wildlife, how to use landscaping to improve water quality, best practices during construction, how to store chemicals, reduce waste, and much, much more. It's designed to be used by property owners on Eastern Georgian Bay, but also inland lakes. So despite the title Life on the Bay, it is meant for both the coast and inland lakes. Individuals can work through all or select portions of the guide to understand how their current practices rate and where improvements can be made. So if you haven't already, you can go over to our website, find the conservation guides under the Environment tab, and download either the entire document or only the chapters that you're most interested in. I'll just point out that Chapter 11, Lowering Your Energy Bill, is a brand new chapter in the guide for this second edition, so you'll definitely want to check that one out for sure. Some of you may have purchased a printed copy when you registered for this event, and if you haven't received it yet, it is in the mail, so it will get to you shortly. If you want to purchase a copy for yourself or someone else in the future, we're planning to have copies available for purchase on our website in the near future. But everything on the website is freely downloadable, so you can go ahead and if you're happy with just an electronic version, you can download all or any of the chapters, and you can feel free to print it at home yourself if there's specific parts that you want. So lots of options there. So let's go back one. So the way the guide is set up, each chapter will take you through a similar series of pages. So let's just have a quick look at lowering your energy bill, this chapter as one example. So the first page in the chapter gives some context around why you should be concerned about the topic and some high-level pointers on what you can do about it. Sprinkled throughout the chapters are citizen science opportunities and other ways to get involved, and you'll see those in these different colored call-out boxes. Next, we come to the self-assessment pages. As a property owner, you'll read through these statements, and then you decide where you fall in the rating scale and record that number in the box. The idea is not to tally up a final score in the end, but rather to identify areas where you're scoring a 1 or a 2 and start focusing on making improvements in those areas. Following the self-assessment pages, many of the chapters also feature a helpful hints page with additional information that can help you make improvements. Every chapter also has a resource list with current helpful resources for learning more about the topic. And finally, each chapter ends with an action plan worksheet. So this worksheet facilitates the process of coming up with an individualized plan to make improvements over both a short and long term in areas that need it most. So this is specific to your ratings, to your property, to your practices, and it's really your chance to make a record of what needs improving over the short and long term, and really have something to go back to kind of check off as you make improvements. An accompaniment to the Life on the Bay Stewardship Guide is the Stewardship Party. So the idea of a stewardship party is to invite friends and neighbors to a host's property and go through a sort of mini assessment of the property using the Life on the Bay Guide. Together, the hosts and guests can point out positive practices and come up with ways to make improvements. And these are really meant to feel more like social gatherings, which I'm hoping we can all kind of get back to this summer, rather than a formal workshop. They're a really great way to learn with a group how to put the guide into practice. For a fee, there's also the opportunity for groups to have a knowledgeable GBB staff come out and lead a stewardship party. So that's what's being shown here in this photo. So if this is something that you or your ratepayer association might be interested in, feel free to reach out to us after today and we can definitely chat about that further. So that wraps up the introduction to Life on the Bay. Again, we want to thank everybody so much for being here. And I know I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of our speakers. I hope you are as well. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen. All right. And we have Julia Sutton up first from Sweetfern Consulting. Julia, I'll invite you to share your screen. So just a reminder, while Julia is presenting, if there's any questions that you have for Julia, please do put those in the Q&A box instead of the chat. That'll just help us be able to find the questions quickly and make sure that we're not missing them in the chat. That's looking good, Julia. I think you're ready to go.
Okay.
Awesome.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here this morning to just share some insights into shoreline naturalization with native plants. Just due to time limitations, I'm not going to get into why shoreline naturalization is so important. I have done presentations on this in the past, and the Biosphere does have one of my past presentations. So if you're interested in those details, they can make that available for you. I really wanted to, for the purpose of this presentation, really get into, if you're interested in naturalization, how you might be able to approach it and what things you might want to think about. So there are a lot of, there can be a lot of misconceptions around naturalizing and some barriers that might prevent you, you might be interested in it, but you might think, okay, well, I've heard these things, or this is sort of, what's preventing me from moving forward. So I do want to kind of address these throughout the presentation. So a big one is, as we're taught as property owners to keep everything very manicured and very tidy. And of course, there's always, in the landscaping industry, what's very popular, what everyone else is doing. Oh, this plant is great, and this can go here, and that kind of thing. And that really kind of puts a pressure on you as someone who owns property as to what you may need to do. Sometimes we also have to plant native plants because it might be part of a permitting process. So in that case, it's coming from a position of authority versus being really excited about planting native plants. I've also heard lots of comments, oh, there's not really a great selection. Native plants, they're kind of boring and ugly. And those are, a lot of that, I'll get into that later in the presentation as well. And also this idea of going back to the landscaping trends, thinking that your property is, making it too wild, and considering what the neighbors think. And it might seem silly, but it is a real thing. You do hear those comments, oh, that house used to be so well maintained. and property owners have really let it, go downhill. And that can happen when we do naturalization projects. And then just the misconception that if you want to naturalize, you won't be able to use your property anymore. So if you want to do a naturalization project, there are some things to consider. So you want to think about what activities do you do on your property, and where do those activities take place? Are there any opportunities in other areas to naturalize or minimize your disturbance? So you want to think about not just where your structures are right now, but what you might want to do in the future. Where is your septic system located? Maybe you have some issues with erosion. Maybe you have mowed lawn and you have a lot of geese. So it doesn't mean that you can't naturalize those areas, but there may be specific ways that you have to approach that. The same with, areas that might receive a lot of runoff, or if you have lower lying areas where a lot of water will collect. And then, native plants are very resilient and maintenance free, but in that first year after planting, you really want to think about how you're going to be able to water those, just to give them the best chance that they can to survive. Especially sometimes we have very limited shallow soils, so just getting them off to the best start that you can. And then thinking about how much do you actually want to plant and how much effort do you want to put into it. So I'm going to talk about actions that you can do that don't really take much effort. Some things that you can do over a season, and then other things that might take multiple years of planning and carrying out. So in terms of things that you could do tomorrow, again, thinking about where you really do your activities. So keeping those activities to those areas, and then on the areas that you're not using, just stopping any maintenance. So if you have a lawn that you might stop mowing, that is really the easiest thing that you can do, and literally it requires no effort on your part. Or maybe there's an area where you don't have a lot of vigorous growth, but you might whippersnip it several times a year. So stopping that whippersnipping. In those areas where you're not doing your activities, if twigs fall on the ground or you've got a couple of branches, in the fall when the leaves come down, just letting those lie on the ground and stay there, because those can really help to reduce runoff, helps absorb any precipitation. It provides habitat, and it also helps build your soil. That really creates a better soil biology, which will help your plants and your trees overall. If you're using any pesticides or mosquito sprays, just not doing that. And then if you do want to do some planting, it's a good time to kind of sit down and think about what you might want to plant. So this is just an example of a project I worked on. So you can see in the top photo, we were mowing to the water's edge. There's a little fringe of natural vegetation there. And what they did there was they stopped mowing, and you can see the bottom photo, that is 1 year later. So really great results. I should mention that it's full sun and there was a lot of soil moisture. So you're going to get a lot more vigorous plant growth in those areas. And it won't stay looking like that. That site is going to evolve over time. There's going to be more flowers and sedges that grow in, because it is a fairly wet area. More shrubs and trees will move in. In terms of things that you can do, so what could you do from the spring to the fall? So this is a time where you could think about adding in some plants to increase your plant diversity and actually do a little bit of restoration. And when you're doing this, thinking about multiple layers of vegetation. So often, we might have really mature trees, and it's easy to forget that we don't have any trees growing up underneath to take the place of those trees in the future. So that just helps in terms of resiliency for climate change, extreme weather events, forest pests and diseases. Adding in multiple layers of vegetation creates a lot of habitat, and also it helps just to filter out runoff. The more layers you have, the better. You might want to consider doing some habitat creation. So something like building a brush pile, which is super easy. It's literally just piling a bunch of branches and leaving them in a spot, which is a really great habitat builder. Maybe you want to consider putting in, a log and a couple of flat rocks for basking for amphibians to see what might come and use them. Sometimes for these projects, there are grants available. Typically, they would have to be used within that season, and cottage associations sometimes have access to them. So they'll get a grant, and then they look for landowners who are interested in doing these types of projects. So this is an example of of one such project that I worked on. So it was a grant that had to be used. We did the work towards the fall, and they had about 5 areas that they figured they weren't using and they could add plants. Because it was a specific budget, we couldn't naturalize really intensively and do a really big area. So we chose some areas. The top 2 photos are basically from the road down to their site is a fairly steep hill. And once it starts running down, it goes straight down their driveway and into the lake. So we wanted to add some vegetation at the top to help slow that down. So we added in a mix of, it was woodland plants. We added in some shrubs and some trees. And we wanted to add in, you can see there that there's some areas that are pretty sparse. Sometimes there's just existing things at the site, like really big roots, rocks, things like that. And you think you can add all these plants. And then in the end, you know, you really have to pick and choose where those go. Another consideration is when they're pulling out of their driveway, they need to be able to see. So we did not do very extensive planting up at the top there. On the left side, the middle photo and the bottom photo, they were just a couple of spots that they didn't use, and they wanted to add some native species to provide some color, some ferns for some texture. So we just added in some species there. And then the bottom right is the shoreline. Their grandkids really extensively use the beach, so they wanted to be able to see them swimming from the cottage. So we stuck to wildflowers mainly, but you'll notice that the trees, you know, fairly similarly sized, and there's not a lot of species diversity. So where the visual wasn't an issue, we did plant a more diverse variety of trees. So the photos that we took right after planting. So I don't have, unfortunately, a photo of the site afterwards. So it doesn't look, it's not going to look really lush until things start growing in the ground. You can see overall they have fairly dry, sandy soil. It can be a bit challenging to get plants to really grow in and take. This is another project I did. So same thing, it was part of a grant, but they'd done some new construction. So we were starting with a clean slate. There was no vegetation in place. So the top left is a slope going down to their dock. And then the top right is 1 year later. So those plants have had a full year, and it's a mix of wildflowers, grasses, and shrubs. And then the bottom left is looking towards that area with the cottage on the left side. And then you can see the bottom right where we've planted both sides of the path. So this is only 1 year later. So I was really happy with how this project worked out. In terms of things that maybe you have a certain project that might take multiple years for planning, and a little bit more of, you know, a vision of what you might want in the future. So if you have a really large area that you want to really restore, maybe you have invasive species that need to be removed before you do any naturalization. That's going to take some time. You might have erosion issues, so you might need to bring in some machinery and apply for a permit and things like that. So that's going to take multiple years. Sometimes it can be beneficial if you have really challenging site conditions to take a year to improve your soil, just to help plant success overall, plant the following year. And then you might want to get into, you know, some more habitat creation that's more species specific. So thinking about where you're going to put these things. If you're going to put up a bat house, where's the best spot, an insect hotel, things like that. So this is just a photo of, so that picture that I showed of the area that they stopped mowing that grew in so nicely. So this is right beside that. So this is dense shade, dry sand, and it had been driven over quite a bit. So it was very compacted. So what we did there, you can see in the bottom photo is we brought compost in. We planted some woodland plants. We didn't put in a large number of plants because what we wanted to do is we wanted to see over time what did well and what didn't. And this can be a great multiple year project if you're not sure what things are going to look like and what you might want to add in the future. So we planned this to be multiple year, and then in the fall we raked leaves on top of the compost so the compost wouldn't run off with rain events. And adding leaves just really helps, again, build that soil biology. It just helps hold the moisture into the soil to help give those plants a better chance. And as you start to do that, it starts to mimic more of a forest. So it's going to be easier for those plants that can really thrive in shade to do better over time because they're going to have better better soil conditions. This is another project that I managed. It was a stream restoration project. So top left, you can see the erosion. One of the landowners wanted to do a restoration project. So the top right, we built a staircase out of soil, used dormant willow and dogwood cuttings, stuffed between the layers and coir fabric to wrap the soil. So this was more intensive. We did use a machine for this, but we did everything else with volunteers. So it's totally doable. And the bottom is 1 year later to see that growth. So this is obviously a more intensive project, required a permit. We needed to, block off the water while we were doing the project. So this requires multiple year planning. So in terms of if you want to make a planting plan, thinking about what already happens in nature. So creating those different height levels and different textures. So having some ferns, having some wildflowers, having some shrub species with woody stems. And then I like to break down the areas according to site conditions, because that's going to tell me, those site conditions are telling me what plants should go there. It can be helpful to calculate the area that you want to plant to tell you how many plants would fit in there. I wouldn't put too much stress on this, because plants, if you order too many, then maybe you're just putting more plants in. It's not going to hurt them. Native plants are very used to coexisting beside each other. If you didn't plant quite enough, then there's always the opportunity to come back the following year and do more planting. Creating your species list based on your conditions. And then you might need to think about things like purchasing tree guards if you're doing shrubs or trees. If you want to improve your soil a little bit, bringing in some compost. A lot of native plants are really good at thriving in, pretty poor soil conditions, but adding that compost in just helps with retaining moisture over time. So when we have now, with climate change, we're getting really prolonged periods of drought. So it just helps ensure there's success over time. And then obviously, if you need something like a permit, planning that out so that you have time to get your permit before you have to actually start your project. And this is just a really rough drawing. It was so basically it's the front lawn of a cottage that fronts onto a lake. And you can just see there, the dotted lines are where I've split it up into different, what I call compartments. So this is based on site conditions. So you can see that within a fairly small area, I have it broken down into 5 different areas. And we have a couple of different planting approaches here. So in a couple of areas, I just have, mixed ground cover and wildflowers. And those are just going to be planted very randomly. They don't need a specific spot. In the other compartments, I have what are called like island plantings, where you plant a grouping of different native species with the idea that they are going to grow outwards and expand over time. And this can be done if you don't have, this was part of a grant, so there was a limited budget. So instead of really intensively planting with a lot of plant material, which gives a more immediate effect, this is a longer, slower process, but can be done if you don't have the time or the resources to do that really intensive planting. It also gives you time to kind of look at plants as they grow and think, oh, I really like that one and I want to plant more of those. So in terms of selecting your plants, there's not a lot that you need to know, but it's very helpful if you know what kind of soil you're dealing with. Maybe you have bedrock and you don't really have a lot of soil. You basically are just wanting to know if you have mainly sand, mainly clay, or kind of a combination, a loam. You can use, if you just Google the jar method, it goes through how you can actually determine that if you can't, if you're unable to do that by looking at it. Soil moisture is really important. So is it wet? Is it dry? Is it sort of normal? How many hours of sunlight you get is also fairly important, keeping in mind that your afternoon sun is more strong than your morning sun. So that can make a difference as to what plants you might put there. If you have a slope, you may want to consider putting in shrubs over wildflowers just to help reinforce that slope a little bit more. You might have some particular site challenges where you need specific plants for that area. I always like to look for existing native plants on site. So often when I'm at a property on the edge or somewhere where they're not doing their human activities, there's often So that picture in the slide shows there's often a patch of native vegetation. And that is what is going to do best at that site in those conditions. So I use those too. It also helps if you're looking and you have a few different sites you have a few different places where you have natural vegetation. Sometimes they won't be the same, and that's a clue that your site conditions have changed. So, so it's really good to just kind of see what's there. And then invasive species. So not just invasive species like Phragmites, but invasive species that we can just buy at the garden centers. So things like periwinkle and goutweed, you know, the ones along the bottom of the slide, false spirea, the miscanthus grasses. If you have those in a site that you want to naturalize, you're going to need to remove them in order to have a successful planting, because if you don't take them out, they'll just outcompete your native plants. And they're definitely, you can remove them over time, but it would take, you know, 1 to 2 years before you want to plant. So this is from the Coalition of Haliburton Property Owners Association, but I worked with them on a project. They wanted to create an online tool that people could go select their site conditions and be provided with a list of what plant species they should get. It's not an exhaustive list, but there's a decent number of plants there. And because I did the plant list for them, I can tell you that all of the plants on that list are completely appropriate for Georgian Bay, Almaguin area, inland lakes. So it's definitely just a helpful tool that you could use if you're wondering what plant species that you should be planting. If you have a shoreline property and you get a lot of water level fluctuations, it's a really common thing. And if you think about, you know, natural rivers where we don't have human disturbance, you know, you have these species that grow along river systems and shorelines that are well adapted to these conditions. So those are the species that you're going to want to focus on if you have fluctuating water levels, and they can handle a fair amount of fluctuation. There's certain species that really can handle more changes than others. So wildflowers like blue vervain, common boneset, they can handle really wet conditions, but they can also handle dry conditions. Shrubs like meadowsweet. So there are certain species within that can handle some drift well. So if you have some bedrock, you know, when you have a bedrock site, you often have, you know, native plants growing up here and there. So you really want to look for those nooks and crannies, and there might be soil already in there, or you might be able to just take a little bit of compost and just kind of put it in there. And this is going to be a little bit of an experiment. So getting a few wildflowers and grasses to start with, and you really want to make sure that you get a seedling with a small root ball, because you can't take a big 1 gallon pot all the time and get that into, you know, those small little nooks and crannies. So small seedlings, and then you're literally just putting the compost in. Sometimes you kind of even have to shove the plant in, and it's amazing how resilient plants can be. So this is a fun thing that you could just try. And then if you have the ability to water them frequently, because they're just not going to have a big moisture base that they can draw from, just to help them get established. And this is a good example. This is in the photo, it's cardinal flower, which grows on shoreline, so it needs moist conditions, but it's growing on a bedrock shelf in the middle of a river. So this is middle of summer, water levels have dropped. So that gives you an idea of how native plants can survive in these conditions after the water is high. So if your property is already natural, you know, things to think about, you know, as I mentioned, multiple layers of vegetation. Do you have, you know, if you have mature trees, do you have a multiple younger trees coming up, trees of different ages? Do you have any opportunities to reduce runoff? Any way that you can increase your buffer between your activities and the natural areas, or even thinking about, you know, your neighbors and the whole area. You know, what areas do animals have and wildlife have to move through? What resources do they have? And can you do something on a bigger scale in cooperation with other people? And then there's always opportunities for increasing plant diversity, adding to your property, doing things like brush piles, pollinator gardens, that kind of thing. In terms of native planting, so to really, so I worked at a garden center many years ago, and, you know, we had 3 native plant species and the rest were ornamental. So that's really where that misconception of, native plants are boring and they're ugly. You need to go to the right place to find your native plants. So native plant nurseries, I find, are just the best to deal with because they have that variety. They have a good supply of those varieties. They have the knowledge. So just like when you go into a garden center for non-native plants, they have that same knowledge, but just for native plants. All of the native plant nurseries that I've worked with, they don't use any pesticides because they don't need to. And they have an ethical way of collecting seed and starting plants. So this is just a list of the ones. Grow Wild from Omimi is one that I work with very frequently. They're really great. They have a good selection of wildflowers. Verbinen's Nursery and Not So Hollow Farm, I found that those 2 nurseries have a very good selection of shrubs that are more appropriate for our area. So I've done a lot. So often in a project, I won't just get native plants from one nursery, I will go to 2. So a lot of my projects, I use Grow Wild and Verbinen's. So in terms, really starting to think about naturalization and landscaping trends and manicured spaces, we really need to think about, as climate change progresses, it's not just humans that are going to be challenged. All of our wildlife is going to be challenged. Our plants are going to be challenged. Our trees are being challenged. So we really want to stop thinking about, what I do on my property and I'm going to keep this really nice and tidy and this, like in all of these areas, because that keeping things tidy is really the worst thing that you can do for wildlife. So really starting to shift towards land ownership to land stewardship. So this is the area that I take care of right now, and I want to make sure that these plants are here in the future, and I want to make sure that the birds can keep coming here and things like that. So really shifting our perception. And it can be a bit scary to be the first one to try it, but there are lots of people doing naturalization projects. So just shifting and our perception to try to find that, messy, or what you would deem as messy, is really beautiful. And often you'll see the wildlife come in and you have that enjoyment. So aside from naturalization, just thinking about other things that you can do, I've talked about leaves and branches. This is shelter from cold, protection from predators. Species use it for nesting, for food. So they just provide a lot of different aspects of habitat. In terms of garden cleanup, I don't clean up any of my gardens in the fall because that's when a lot of insect species are looking to overwinter. So things like solitary bees, they'll overwinter in dry leaves. They might go into hollow cavities of stems or logs. So I really just want to leave that there for them over the winter. Songbirds come and visit the dead flower heads in the winter for seed. So I leave those up. And then in the spring, it can be so tempting, you get that really nice day and you want to just get out in the garden, but you really want to wait till you have several days of 10 degrees Celsius plus, because that will give your pollinators a chance. If you've got pollinators overwintering there, they'll wake up and move on. Whereas if you have one day and then it gets cold again, if you've disturbed them, then that exposes them to the cold and to weather events that they may not be ready for. So really shifting about when we do those maintenance activities, how we do them and when. And then of course, just avoiding chemicals and mosquito sprays overall is really important. So we want to see less of this and more of this. And that's about all I have for today.
Perfect, I'm unmuted now.
Okay, I was like, I can't hear.
Yep, no, that's me. So what I was saying is, thanks so much, Julia. That was a fantastic presentation, super inspiring. I love to see those before and after photos. It's really, really great. And I love that idea of switching our mindset from land ownership to land stewardship. So that's a really fantastic message. We've got a number of questions here, and I know we received a number of questions in advance as well. I'll start with one here that we received in advance. So I'll kind of go back and forth. And again, if we aren't able to get through them all, we will find a way to get those answers to folks afterwards. So the first question, again, this is one we received ahead of time. Somebody's wondering about plants that are particularly recommended for shorelines near agricultural areas. We have a lot of clay in our soil and it is a flooded area.
So there's definitely quite a few native plants that you can plant in wet areas that are mainly clay. My question would be for the agriculture, if the agriculture is causing an issue in terms of erosion, or if there's pesticide drift, or if it's just that it's close to the agricultural area. If it's not causing any issues, then I wouldn't necessarily recommend certain things. However, if there was issues with pesticide drift, I would maybe put up more shrubs, some taller things to help sort of catch that pesticide drift. If there's erosion issues, again, there'd be certain shrubs that I would use, or certain plants that I would use to help prevent that erosion from transferring from that property to the other property. And then it's just a matter of maybe how long the flooding lasts, and if there's vegetation growing there. If there isn't, then what would maybe be preventing that vegetation from growing?
Right. Great. Now this next question, you can, by all means, you can answer. You can also, if you'd like to defer, we've got Margaret Scott coming up next. So this has kind of got a forestry slant to it as well. So we can have both of you answer, or you can defer to Margaret, whichever you prefer. So Stacey's asking, after all of the what's now termed spongy moth, so the sort of the decimation of many trees from those caterpillars, should we let nature decide how it recovers, or is this the time to start rebuilding some of the trees now?
That's a really interesting question, and I have asked that same question before when in the very beginning with emerald ash borer. When we were first learning about it, I was like, should we be planting ash or should we not plant ash? And, you know, and I'd be interested, I think Margaret would be able to provide a better answer, but from my perspective, the more diversity we have, the better. So because there is some unknown built in there, it's a little bit of trial and error. So just, we don't know always what trees are going to be more resilient to these pests and diseases. So things like, you know, butternut, there's some butternuts that don't get the canker. So it's really important, you know, there was a project in Eastern Ontario where they were collecting the butternuts, leaving the butternuts, collecting the seed from the resilient trees, and then propagating those for the future. So there's lots of opportunity for that, I believe, but I think we need to keep planting because we're not sure what we're going to lose and what we're going to gain.
Great. And I'll also ask that to Margaret as well after her presentation and get her thoughts. I'll go back to some questions received in advance. So there's a couple questions related to septic. So I'll ask both of those. So are there natural plants that would be particularly more effective at absorbing phosphorus leachate from septic systems? And the other simply asks, what can you grow over a septic bed?
So for in terms of phosphorus, all plants need phosphorus to grow, but so I grow vegetables, so a lot of your fruiting species need more phosphorus than, say, your leafy species or your flowering species. So those ones may uptake more phosphorus than the other ones because they just need it for their production. So anything that creates seed, like a fruit, so like an acorn or a cherry tree, things like that. Wetland plants, especially things like cattails, are very effective at removing phosphorus from mainly from the soil. But in those cases, you really want to allow for the vegetation to die off, decompose, and in order for it to continue to uptake the phosphorus, you need to keep building your soil up, decomposition, if that makes sense. So I don't know that there are some plants that are a little bit more suited for that, but all plants would uptake phosphorus. And in terms of plants for septic, I will email a list to Katrina, in addition to some of the species that would do well in the flooded clay area as well.
Great. So you can let me know if this is covered by your list or if you'd like to answer it now, but we did receive a couple questions a bit more with clay. So I'd love to know how to grow in clay soil and how to amend it for planting native species, can you amend small sections for each plant, or does it require a truckload of soil?
So you can do, and again, it kind of comes down to that planning. So if you want to do more of an intensive amendment in a small area over multiple years, or if you want to do a big area and just remediate in that right where you dig the hole for your plant. There's a lot of native species that can handle clay because, you know, there's a lot of shorelines that are just straight up clay, and native species can grow there no problem. So I will send, again, I'll send that list to Katrina. But in terms of amendments, if you have clay soil or if you have really sandy soil, compost is always the answer. So just, and make sure that it's, you know, you can get compost. I wouldn't necessarily recommend like a manure compost if you're on a shoreline, but a compost made from leaves and mulch is a good one for that. And then again, adding in leaf matter to help with decomposition, and well composted wood mulch on top will help with those soils. But we've done a fair bit of planting in clay areas, and it's just about picking the species and then, yeah, adding in a lot of compost to allow it's more to prevent the roots from being really compacted, giving them a chance to. So you dig your hole extra big if you wanted to just remediate that exact spot. Dig your hole extra big so that you can add in a lot of compost to give it some time to get a good root ball, and then it can spread out from there while choosing species that are more suited to clay.
Great. So yeah, everyone can look forward to that that list from Julia, as well as the list of sort of septic safe plants as well. Do you suggest any type of planting to consider tick populations? We've been trimming grass plants quite short around mature trees and keeping wide open areas to combat ticks. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think it comes down to again, thinking about the areas that you use and the areas that you don't use. So if you're not going to be walking in those areas, then I would not maintain those areas. However, if it's a walking path, then I would continue to maintain that, either by mowing or whippersnipping, depending on what you have. A lot of, you know, if you really have an area of concern, height would be a thing. So going for more of a shorter plant. So this would be easier in a shadier section, because a lot of plants that want the full sun, they get taller. But you've got low growing, you know, when you walk into the forest, you have all your spring plants, you've got your woodland plants, things that grow fairly low to the ground will, or as much as the research shows, ticks won't be in there as much as they would, say, long grasses or wildflowers or shrubs. From what I've read as well, they don't tend to be on trees as much. But again, it's really thinking about, you know, we do that here. So we have really tall grass, like we have an old farm. So we have a lot of acreage of really tall grass. We don't mow any of it except for right where we walk. And if our dog goes into the area, then we check her afterwards.
Great. What effect does porcupine predation have on mature trees?
Well, it can have a pretty devastating effect depending on if it's really focused right in. And again, it comes down to, is it just really focusing on where you are, or is it sort of spreading out its activities around the neighborhood? If it's more spread out, you know, when you get the odd shoe, we have it in our forest. We had a porcupine living in there for quite a while, and it didn't decimate full trees. It would take patches off of trees, which can, I think, if you know, it could affect tree health over the long term. But we haven't seen any. We haven't seen any issues. They tend to, you know, that porcupine was there for a while and then it wasn't. So they do tend to get, you know, they'll get predated on by fishers, or they might move on to a different area. So we've definitely seen those effects, but as long as they're not stripping an entire tree, you know, anytime you take the bark off around the diameter of the tree, it's not a good thing. But overall, if it's light damage, then they seem to be able to sustain it.
Great, thanks so much, Julia. We have one more question here that we haven't brought up yet, but I think it would be well suited to Margaret, so we'll leave that one for after her presentation. So thanks again so much, Julia. I know everyone's going to appreciate the resources that you share as well. And just so folks know, we are keeping a list of all the resources that are being brought up in the chat. And so we'll also provide those in the follow-up email as well. Thanks again, Julia.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so we will now turn it over to Margaret Scott from Westwind Forest Stewardship. You're good to go ahead and share your screen.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Can I just confirm you can hear me?
Yep, sounds good.
Perfect. Thank you. So I will turn my camera off during my presentation just for my internet and make sure that you can see everything. But I guess if you want to confirm my identity now, I'll have the camera on for these 2 seconds. Perfect.
Good.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, so I have shortened my presentation from forest pests and diseases to just forest pests. When I ended up choosing kind of the 3 things I wanted to focus on, realized that I was just going to be talking about pests. So today I'm going to be talking about spongy moth, emerald ash borer, and introduced pine sawfly. I'm Margaret Scott. I'm a registered professional forester at Westwind Forest Stewardship. In terms of what Westwind does, we hold the sustainable forest license for the French Severn Forest. So that's roughly from Algonquin Park to Georgian Bay, from the French River down to the Severn River. And we do the forest management on Crown land. So we're not doing private land activities or anything like that. Forest management includes kind of the planning, all the compliance activities. So although we're not actually doing harvesting ourselves, we have overlapping licensees who are overseeing things, making sure things are done right and sustainably. And then we're also working with planting, tending, site preparation, that kind of thing, to make sure that we're growing the forest as well. Some of the things that make Westwind a little unique, we were the first large public forest certified by FSC in Canada, and that was back in 2002. We're also a not-for-profit, and we're a community-based organization. So our board of directors has industry representatives, but also community and Indigenous representation on it. And we also kind of work with our partners like GBB to do presentations like this, articles. I go into classrooms and talk with kids, as well as forest walkthroughs and that kind of thing. So just really trying to be a part of our community and forest. The first pest I wanted to talk about is the spongy moth. This is formerly the pest known as gypsy moth that you would have seen, most people around here would have seen last year. It was decided gypsy moth wasn't really an appropriate name for it, and they've changed the common name to spongy moth. So that's what I'm referring to going forward. And its scientific name is Lymantria dispar. So it's an invasive pest that defoliates trees. So it feeds on their leaves. The spongy moth was first introduced to North America in the 1860s in hopes of crossbreeding it with the North American silkworm for the silk industry. It didn't work and was introduced into the wild, unfortunately. And then it was first detected in Ontario for the first time in 1969. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about is kind of the life stages of the spongy moth and how to identify them. These egg masses are probably, if you have spongy moth on your trees, what you're seeing right now. They can be found on tree trunks, bark, or other hard surfaces like furniture, wood, decks, kind of anywhere. The eggs are laid in August and they overwinter in this stage until April, and they're tan colored and can have almost a fuzzy appearance. If they overwinter, they can also kind of get like a creamy white coloring as well, so they're not always tanned. And then size-wise, the egg masses are usually about 2 to 8 centimeters long. And so although they're not huge, within this small area, they can contain 100 to 1,000 eggs. So unfortunately, many caterpillars inside those eggs. Speaking about caterpillars, these larvae or caterpillars are the stage that feed on the leaves. They usually hatch in the spring, sometime in May, and the caterpillars begin feeding. They have 5 to 6 instar stages where they shed their skin and get bigger. And the later stages when the caterpillar is more mature, is when you can identify it by the 5 pairs of blue dots and 6 pairs of red dots on their back. You can see it in the picture there with those 5 pairs of blue dots at the beginning, and then towards the back, you've got the 6 pairs of red dots, and they're about 5 to 7 centimeters long. Next up, they pupate. So they're in a pupae or a cocoon. It's dark brown with white to yellow hairs. And then once the adults emerge, these are left behind. So you can actually see these on some of the trees that had spongy moth last year. And they just, they will stay on the tree for a while. And then finally, we get to the adult moth. The adult moths do not feed on anything, and their only purpose is to reproduce. So this is not where you're going to see the leaves being eaten. By the time the adult moths come, that damage has been done. So the female is the larger cream or white colored moth. You can see her on the top there. And then she also has brown or black dots on the wingtips. The male, on the other hand, who's kind of to the left, is smaller and brown. It has distinctive wave-like patterns on its wings. And interestingly enough, the female actually can't fly, and she uses pheromones to attract the male. Although I think people are probably fairly familiar with some of the impacts of gypsy moths, they do prefer oak trees, but actually have over 300 plant hosts, including maple, birch, white pine, and white spruce. And a single caterpillar can eat up to 1 meter square of leaves in one season. So that's, 1 year of growth. Although this defoliation can look very harmful, many healthy trees can withstand 1 or more years of defoliation. So just because it can look really bad, that doesn't mean your tree's definitely a goner. Some trees will even have a reflush later in the summer once the caterpillars are gone. Unfortunately, this takes a lot of energy from the tree. There's not as much time left in the season for it to regain that energy through photosynthesis in those leaves. Of course, a combination of stresses such as droughts, diseases, pests, or even prolonged defoliation can lead to tree mortality. And if a tree is already unhealthy, it may not do as well against spongy moth. So it really depends on kind of how the tree started out health-wise, how long it's being defoliated for, and if there's other stresses present as well. Of course, spongy moth isn't new to Ontario. This graph here shows moderate to severe defoliation in Ontario. So it's not just local area, but all of Ontario. And you can see that we kind of expect to have an outbreak every 7 to 10 years. Although it's an invasive species, spongy moth has reached a state of kind of naturalization, which means the population may have periodic kind of predictable outbreaks. We, however, haven't had an outbreak since the early 90s. We've had some minor localized increases, but no kind of major outbreaks. So it was expected that something like this would happen, and it certainly did last year. So in 2019 and 2020, there was some defoliation from spongy moth, but 2021 certainly had a lot more defoliation and was a lot more noticeable. This graph doesn't show 2021, it's just up to 2020. This is a map that shows area of defoliation caused by spongy moth. Moderate to severe defoliation is in red, and then there's not much of it, but light defoliation is shown in yellow. This is for 2021, so last year, and we had quite a bit of severe defoliation in the southeast area of our district. So where we are is just pretty much in the middle of the map. You can see Parry Sound, that's our district, and then kind of the the southwest of our district is where we saw a lot of defoliation. The Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources and Forestry also does egg mass surveys to kind of forecast what we expect future defoliation to look like. So this is what you're seeing on this map, and kind of the light red in the background, you can kind of ignore that. That's just from the map before and just shows defoliation from last year. The thing you want to focus on are the circles here. So those are the locations of the egg mass surveys. And depending on how many egg masses they found in an area, that's what they're using to predict how much defoliation they expect for the next year. So around the Parry Sound area, again, you can see those 2 red circles. They're expecting severe defoliation for this year. And then kind of to the south of us, as you get closer to I guess the border near where Aurelia is, that kind of thing. One of the egg mass surveys predicted moderate and one predicted severe. Thankfully, when it comes to spongy moth, it's not all doom and gloom. There are natural controls, including a fungus, a virus, and predators that usually help to control populations of the spongy moth back to more manageable levels 1 to 3 years after the outbreak. So the fungus, Entomophaga maggi, I'm sorry, I'm probably butchering that name, is a fungus from Japan introduced to North America that causes widespread mortality of spongy moth caterpillars. It has a greater effect when there's a cool, wet spring, so it does kind of depend on what the weather is this spring. Dead caterpillars are brittle and dry, as seen on the photo on the left, and they eventually drop to the ground. Another really important control is the nucleopolyhedrosis virus, or NPV, and it's a virus which only affects and kills the spongy moth. It occurs naturally, but it only happens in those large populations of spongy moths. And as you can see in the photo on the right, the caterpillars infected with the virus look like an inverted V. It's easy for me to remember. I always think, virus, V, and it's just an upside down V. The virus liquefies the inside of the caterpillar, which leaks, and other caterpillars crawl across and become infected. And certainly even last year, I'm not sure if other people saw this, but on my own trees, I saw both of these present. So I saw the virus and the fungus, which is a great sign for controlling the population. And on walks around Parry Sound, I saw that evidence as well. Another possible control is cold temperatures. The egg masses are cold tolerant down to -20, -25 degrees Celsius in the winter. So if temperatures get below this, but it has to be for sustained periods of time, this can start to cause egg mass mortality. Unfortunately, egg masses below the snow do have a higher likelihood of survival, so it's definitely not a guarantee. But while you're waiting for these natural mechanisms to control the population, what can you do? The first option is to scrape egg masses off surfaces and to kill them. Egg masses can be found and removed from a variety of surfaces, kind of like I was talking about earlier. They can be anywhere. Remember that the caterpillars will start emerging in May, so this needs to happen before that. With a butter knife or a plastic paint scraper or kind of anything similar, you can just scrape the egg masses into soapy water and leave it for 48 hours before disposing of them. Unfortunately, caterpillars can still emerge from egg masses that fall to the ground, so they do need to be put in that soapy water to kill them. So just try as best as you can to get as much of the egg mass into your container, just to kind of have maximum kill of those. Spongy moth caterpillars have long hairs that can cause skin irritation or allergic reactions for some people, so it's always best to wear gloves if you're going to handle them. Once we're past that egg mass stage, you can also do some manual control of caterpillars. So it can be easier to hand pick them off the tree by using a burlap wrap. So this is done, wrap a piece of burlap around the trunk of the tree, tie a piece of twine or rope around the center of the burlap, and then drape the burlap over the rope so there's an overhang. You can see that kind of in step 3 there. So the caterpillars will seek shelter from predators and heat during the day by crawling into the overhanging burlap. And then you can check this in the afternoon and pick off any of the caterpillars. So it's really just, it's not so much a trap as kind of collecting them all for you, so you're not having to try to kind of go all over your tree and find them. Once you pick them off, similar thing, put them in soapy water for 48 hours. And again, because they can cause irritation, just wear gloves when you're going to be dealing with them. And you can also hand pick the cocoons off the tree as well. There are pesticide options as well. The most common is a biological pesticide called BTK. It's a naturally occurring bacteria found in the soil that can be applied to the foliage of trees. The caterpillars must ingest the pesticide in order for it to be effective. So the timing of application is particularly important and must be done in the early stage of caterpillar development when caterpillars are beginning to feed on foliage. Sorry, there's a train in the background. I'm not sure if people can hear that. Application timing is also important to ensure that BTK does not affect other Lepidoptera species like butterflies and moths. So affecting non-target species is pretty common concern, but it's actually a low risk because spongy moth is treated at about 50% leaf off and in a forest setting and generally not around water. So there are a few Lepidoptera species getting indirectly treated. And BTK breaks down on the leaves in about 48 hours, so it's also not sticking around. Although BTK can help to reduce the population to more manageable levels, it does not eradicate all spongy moth insects. So BTK can be applied by a registered pesticide application company or by homeowners who have thoroughly and carefully read application instructions. For larger projects, only certified pesticide application companies should apply it. An aerial spray of BTK was done last year by some landowners and organizations in some of the harder hit areas of the province last year, and will likely happen again this year. Unfortunately, I looked it up the other day, the main company that did it last year had an application deadline of March 1st for this year. So unless you can find another company that's taking requests for treatments now, it may not be possible to kind of get that aerial spray this year. There's also the option of using triazine, but it's also a common control method for emerald ash borer, so I'm going to focus on it there, but it is also an option. Finally, I just wanted to show this fantastic graphic from the City of London. It shows gypsy moth just because I did get it last year, but it's referring to spongy moth. And what it shows is kind of the life cycle of the spongy moth, including what you can do. So during the winter, kind of September to mid-April, destroy those egg masses. And then once we get into the caterpillar stage, you can do that burlap banding. There's a very specific time when you want to be applying that biological pesticide. And then of course there's hand picking. So I just really like this graphic to kind of tie everything together. Okay, the next pest I wanted to talk about is emerald ash borer, or EAB as it's often called. So it's an invasive beetle that's been found to attack most species of ash, and it's native to East Asia, first detected in Windsor in 2002, but now has been found in Southern Ontario, Quebec, Thunder Bay, and Sault Ste. Marie. It's all over the place. Locally, it's been found in Gravenhurst and Bracebridge in 2018 and in Killbear Provincial Park in 2019. The MND MNRF has also confirmed it in Port Severn, Bala, Perry Island, Perry Sound, west of Mactier, and a bit north of Killbear as well. It's important to note that that's just a confirmation that it's there and doesn't necessarily give us an idea of how widespread it is. But how do you identify EAB itself? So the pest, the adults have elongated bodies that are metallic green, and they're about 1 to 1.5 centimeters long. We have black heads and black eyes and a flat head. And then on the right, you can see the larvae is a creamy white with 10 bell-shaped abdominal segments. And when they're fully mature, they're about 3 centimeters long. Unfortunately, these aren't actually what you're going to see most often. You're likely going to see the symptoms first. So the impacts of emerald ash borers. The galleries that the borer create, they girdle the tree by cutting off the flow of water and nutrients. And this may result in the dieback of branches and leaves of the tree as it dies from the top down. The leaves may also turn yellow and wilt, so you can look for that. These feeding galleries also can create bark cracks that are about 7 to 10 centimeters long. And because woodpeckers feed on the larvae, you can also look for increased woodpecker damage. Of course, woodpecker damage by itself, woodpeckers have other food, and so it's not necessarily emerald ash borer, but it's another symptom that you can look for. The adult borers also emerge from distinctly D-shaped holes that are about 4 millimeters across. So in that photo, you can see kind of in the middle, there's a hole there. It's flat on the top and then curved on the bottom. So it's almost like a sideways D. And that's the shape of the hole that you're looking for. Finally, if you notice signs of infestation and remove some of the bark, you see S-shaped galleries that the larvae have created. But by the time signs and symptoms of the attack are visible, trees have usually been infected for about 3 to 4 years. So you're not going to see it right away. In terms of treatment options, like I was talking about earlier, there's really only 2 main options for urban trees: insecticide treatment or cutting down the tree. So triazine is the main insecticide being used to control EAB. It's injected onto the tree's bark and moves upward with the flow of water and nutrients. You can see it in the photo there. It's applied between May and August, and since it is a pesticide, it must be applied by a licensed professional. It can be effective at controlling EAB for up to 2 years, but I know some areas are using it every year, kind of at that peak of infestation. And like I said, this can also be used to treat spongy moth, but I wanted to focus on it here. And although this can be a great option, it's important to consider what trees are ideal for this treatment. So first of all, it's obviously important that they're in an area with EAB or it's not necessary. The tree should have good overall health and be structurally sound to ensure that it's worth treating. And triazine is usually applied to trees which would be difficult or expensive to remove or replace, or that have some kind of significant value to you. So it can get costly depending on the size of the ash tree. So you want to make sure that you're selecting trees appropriately. Of course, there's also the option to remove trees, and this is especially important if a tree is declining as a result of EAB and poses a risk to people or property. So if it's a hazard tree of any kind. If you're concerned about a tree, it's best to consult a forestry professional such as an arborist. And depending on where you live, some municipalities may have tree cutting bylaws or permits, so it's best to check on that before cutting a tree down. Once the tree is cut, it's also really important that the wood is not moved outside the Canadian Food Inspection Agency regulated area that we're in. So that just is to help it from spreading to areas where emerald ash borer hasn't got yet, because we don't need to be helping it get there. And in general, it's just a good idea that when you have infected wood, not moving it to new locations and spreading that pest. When we're talking about larger areas and woodlots, there are a few more management options. So although it might seem like you do not need to remove all ash trees. Instead, you want to encourage diversity in the woodlot by promoting other species and potentially just reducing the ash component. If you're going to thin your woodlot, you want to focus on removing poor quality stems of all species, aside from those that you're going to keep for wildlife. A forestry professional can help you make decisions that will take into account the long-term goals and sustainability of your woodlot. And again, if you are cutting down trees, it's important not to move those to new areas. The last pest I wanted to talk about is the introduced pine sawfly. There has been quite a bit of local interest in this pest, particularly along the Georgian Bay and the islands. So I wanted to provide some information. Although recent populations of this pest have not been high, I think folks have had a consistent interest in the pest, so that's why I'm going to be speaking about it today. Introduced pine sawfly is an invasive pest first recorded in Canada in 1931 in Oakville. They will attack several species of pine, but in particular, they like white pine. They have been present throughout the Georgian Bay Islands since the early 1990s, but then there was a major outbreak in the year 2000. And high populations like this, where there's that outbreak, can result in the mortality of branches and trees. So the larvae or caterpillars are about 1 inch long when fully grown. And you can see in the photos, they're kind of a whitish with yellow and black spots, and they have a shiny black head. There's 2 generations of this caterpillar a year. One hatches in the early summer, and then the second in the late summer. And this is the stage that feeds on the needles of the pine. These caterpillars then pupate in tough brown oval cocoons, which are about 1/2 inch long. So they can be attached to needles, twigs, or even on the bark of the trees. And then from here, they become the mature sawflies, and the cycle continues. As I was saying, the first generation of caterpillars in the early hatches in the early summer and eats the previous year's needles. And then the second generation later in the summer eats both the current and previous year's needles. Small populations of introduced pine sawfly can cause kind of trace to moderate defoliation, but may not have kind of that huge detrimental impact on the tree. However, higher populations, as I said, can cause the branch or even the tree to die when you've got those high levels. It's of course important to note that other stresses such as drought may combine with that defoliation to cause more severe impacts. In speaking to the MND MNRF recently, based on surveys they did in the northern part of Parry Sound District, they assumed that populations last year were low. They also said that like most sawflies, infestations of the introduced pine sawfly are short-lived, as they have many natural predators and other pathogens that kind of keep that population in check. However, when you do have those higher populations, there are some options. So Triazine injections, I know I've mentioned this for all of this, can be used to protect individual trees. There's also a number of insecticide spray options that you would likely want to consult with an arborist or a forestry professional, as well as the pesticide labels, just to make sure that the treatment is occurring during the right time period, as well as with the correct protections and licensing. For folks who kind of want to do something more manual and small scale, you can also kill the confirmed larvae. You can simply pick off the caterpillars and unhatched cocoons and destroy them. Note that in this photo, the sawfly has already emerged from the cocoon, so there's no need to destroy ones like this. The sawfly is gone, and so you're not really going to be accomplishing anything, but when those cocoons are closed, you can certainly destroy them. For taller trees, a water hose could also be used to knock off larvae as well. And of course, with any of these pests, watering during times of stress or during times of drought can also help kind of to reduce stress on the tree and maybe even keep it healthier long term. As I do in every forest health discussion, I just really want to stress not to move firewood. It's a really common mechanism for spreading forest pests and diseases. So please buy wood close to your destination, burn it close to where you bought it, so you don't risk bringing any unwelcome hitchhikers to new areas and helping out those pests. So thank you so much for listening today, and I'll pass it back to Katrina.
Thanks so much, Margaret. That was great. And we do have some questions coming in. As I mentioned during Julia's presentation, or following her presentation, we do have this one question that I think was kind of applicable to both of yours. So I'll start with that one. I'll read it again. After all the gypsy moths, should we let nature decide how it recovers, or is this the time to start rebuilding some of the trees now?
There we go. Yeah, so I think the most important thing with any of these pests or diseases is, as much as possible, and I think Julia said this, we want to promote diversity because it can be really tempting following a pest that infects one tree to kind of shift all your focus to, you know, maybe, oh, maples aren't being attacked right now, so we'll plant all maples or we'll plant all something else. But this spongy moth outbreak, although really difficult to deal with right at this moment, should be over in a few more years. And then we don't know what's going to happen after that. So I would say the most important thing is, you know, you want to make sure you're planting a diverse range of native trees. And then you also want to be looking at, as Julia kind of mentioned for plants, what your conditions are. So what's the shade tolerance of the trees that you're planting? You know, can they handle a lot of sunlight if you're planting it in a yard with nothing else? Also really important to look at the amount of area you have for the roots. You know, just because you can fit a tree in, will it have area below as well? So yeah, I think the most important thing, focusing on native, focusing on matching the tree to the property, the area that you are, and then also making sure that you're not focusing too hard on one individual species, but planting trees that can handle, you know, the pests of the future as well, because we know this isn't going to be the last pest that we see, unfortunately.
Great answer. I know on my own property, we got hit very hard by the spongy moth, but we did later in the summer see a second flush from many of the trees, and so that's a positive sign, or at least I take it as a positive sign.
Yeah, and I should say too, like, it can look really devastating, and certainly trees that weren't healthy, they may succumb to this, or if they have multiple years, they may succumb to this, but don't feel you need to give up on every tree. You know, like some of the trees, some healthy trees will survive. And I know it's devastating now, but it will be over. These viruses and fungus will help to control the populations.
Yeah, great information. All right. I am on a small island and our hemlock was attacked by some insect last August. Is there anything that we can do to save it, protect the other trees?
So without kind of being able to see it and know what it is, I hesitate to give kind of a specific answer for that one. Like anything else, I know I said it for the other ones, but, you know, trees will benefit if you've got a drought and you can water them during that period. Just try to keep them as healthy as possible. But in terms of like protecting other trees from whatever this insect is, I hesitate to give an answer without knowing exactly what it is. Sorry.
That's fair. Is the spongy moth caterpillar poop a useful fertilizer due to their diet? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I've got to say that's the first time I've got that that question. I think it's accidentally become a fertilizer for a lot of people's lawns because there's so much of it. But I don't actually know the nutrient kind of makeup of it, but that may be something interesting if we're sending out resources later on. That's something I would be quite interested in looking up and seeing if there's any information on what's in that. But yeah, no, I'm not sure about that one.
That's fair. Can you burn the infected ash wood?
Yeah, my understanding is the answer to that is yes. As long as, again, it's the kind of thing where you want to be keeping it as low as possible and not moving it to new locations. Because even if you don't think that the bug is in the section of wood that you have, it's really hard to tell. So if you're cutting down an ash tree and then kind of burning it in your backyard, I don't believe that there's any issues with that. Especially, yeah, the big thing is just definitely not moving it.
The EAB, as I understand, can fly up to 10 kilometers to its next location after it has destroyed its current food source. Does this mean it's unstoppable?
Yeah, I don't think we're trying, at this point, unfortunately, I don't think we're trying to stop it. I think we're trying to slow it down. I was talking with someone the other day about, I'm not sure how it will impact ash that are in kind of large forests that don't have kind of ash stands leading to that area. So that's something I want to kind of learn more about, is if there aren't ash for it to kind of use along the way, is there any way that some stands will be protected? But maybe with the amount of distance that they are able to fly to get there, we don't have much of a chance. But yeah, my understanding is the biggest way that it is moving, though, is from the movement of firewood. Like Killbear Provincial Park got it earlier than some surrounding areas, and I don't think that's unfortunately a coincidence. So I think the biggest thing we can do is just, as with a lot of these pests, slow it down, manage it the best we can. So that's removing or treating trees to kind of stop it the best we can. But yeah, I don't think it's something that we're going to completely be able to contain at this point, unfortunately.
Great. We do have one more question. It's actually for Julia. So Julia, if you are still with us, you can pop your camera. Okay, I think I see you there. So this last question before we break, is there anything that has a dense root system that beavers do not like? And I think the idea is species that would protect the shoreline of a creek bank specifically.
I don't know of any tree that a beaver would maybe stay away from in terms of its root system. I would go for, in that case, for a shoreline. That's where you can really get into wildflowers, cattails, grasses, sedges, things that beavers wouldn't eat. And those have really dense root systems. Native plants in general have a lot more dense root systems than, say, the grass that you have on your lawn. So automatically they provide a benefit. Shrubs, if they're really small, they may not do the shrubs, but that's also where you can put in, use the hardware cloth, so the wire mesh with the small squares. Maybe you want to do 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch, and just putting that around the base of a tree or a shrub that you want to sort of nurture and prevent the beavers from chewing. But unfortunately, I don't really know of a beaver-proof plant. But again, yeah, herbaceous species wouldn't be an issue, and still provide a lot of bank protection and all sorts of functions.
Perfect. Thanks a bunch. All right, so with that, we will take a break until 10:45, and at that point, we will return to our presentations. So thanks so much again to our first two presenters. Everybody enjoy a break, and we will be back at 10:45. Awesome. All right. We did have a comment, a comment in the Q&A over the break, and it's just about around the wire protection for trees or shrubs, protection from beavers. When you are doing that, just be sure that you look into the sizing of the spaces in that mesh or wiring. Certain sizes can actually be hazardous to snakes that can potentially get stuck crawling through. So just do a little bit of research on exactly what size is the best for that, so that you don't inadvertently end up harming snakes in the process. All right, next we're going to welcome Danielle Ward from Adams Brothers. So Danielle, if you're ready, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. I am going to leave my camera off, or everything tends to freeze on me, so it's always fun. Not sure if that's up.
That's
clearly.
perfect.
Okay.
Yep. Great.
Yeah, so obviously septic systems or sewage systems, there's a whole bunch of different terminations of what you want to call it, but they can have huge effects on, you know, the water, your neighbors. It's not just your own property. So septic systems, especially for a lot of lakefront owners, you're swimming in it, you're drinking from it. So there's a lot more thought that goes into a septic system than a lot of people think, but we'll get started here. Now, there is a lot more to septic systems than this presentation is going to be able to give you, but this at least gives an idea of what it is, how to use it properly, and how to maintain it. So what is a septic system? A septic system or sewage system is your very own on-site sewage treatment / collection facility that is necessary where municipal sewer systems are not feasible or accessible. So there are, you know, say for me in Perry Sound, there are some properties right in town that still have septic systems. They haven't upgraded to sewer yet, but obviously, you know, when we get into the more rural areas or islands, then they are a huge necessity. So these systems are carefully designed according to site conditions and Ontario Building Code regulations. The system is designed to collect black and/or gray water from the building, separate the solids, begin decomposition, then pass the clarified wastewater to the drain field for final treatment to be released back into the environment. So the water is a cycle, right? We're pulling it from the lake, we're drinking it, we are sending it to our sewage system, it's treated, and it's put back into the environment. So having a properly maintained system is very important for this process. So what are the different types of systems? So class 1 would be your chemical toilet, incinerating toilet, recirculating toilet, self-contained portable toilet, and all forms of privies. So outhouses, some of them just have a tank underneath that need to get pumped, but there are, in most places, no requirements for an outhouse, but there are guidelines as far as how an outhouse should be constructed and how deep it should be dug. You know, all those considerations if you are putting an outhouse, say, on an island property or even in your backyard, wherever you might be. There are guidelines that you should definitely look into before you ever actually put up an outhouse, because you can severely affect your own property, if not your neighbor's property, in the waterways. So class 2 is a gray water pit, pretty common on some islands. Class 3 is a cesspool. Those are not overly common anymore. Our, you know, most typical is the class 4, which is a leaching bed system, and class 5, which is a holding tank. So today's presentation is going to focus on the most common system, which is the class 4 or leaching bed systems. There are 2 different types of class 4 systems. So we've got conventional as well as advanced treatment systems. Now, even though we're focusing on class 4, at the end, if there's time for questions and whatnot, can certainly take some questions on outhouses, gray water pits, holding tanks, that kind of stuff, or my email will be up at the end as well. So a conventional class 4 septic system, are typically comprised of a septic tank and a leaching bed or drain field. Depending on the site topography, some homes will have a pump chamber to feed either the septic tank or the leaching field. Now, typically this is what you'll have at your home, your cottage, but every configuration is going to be different as it is very site dependent. So, you know, the different kinds of soils you have on site dictate how big certain things need to be, as well as the size of your home too. Septic tanks. So a septic tank is typically a 2-compartment tank in one large tank. So you're going to have a center partition in there to separate the solids from the liquid side with transfer holes. So when you flush the toilet, this obviously is based on a gravity-fed system, but when you flush the toilet, the waste comes into compartment 1, which is what we would call the solid side of your tank, which is also the larger portion. That's where the solids settle. The effluent transfers to compartment 2 and then out to the leaching field. So your tank always sits typically, I mean, it can vary depending on the tank maker, but anywhere from 1 foot to 6 inches from the top is where the liquid level should always be. Because when 5 gallons comes in, 5 gallons gets pushed out. So, you know, some people tend to open up their septic tank and they're like, oh no, it's full, but really it might be at the working level. If you're not sure, this is where you'd want to consult a professional. So the septic tank is essentially, it's got a lot of living bacteria in it. So this is where bacterial breakdown and fermentation happens. If you could imagine that you didn't have healthy bacteria in your tank, you would have backups, plug-ups, your tank would be probably overflowing, because what happens is there is a very large amount of breakdown that happens inside that tank. And if you figure how many times you go to the bathroom over 5 years, what that tank would look like. If you don't have proper bacteria set up in your tank, then things might not go well. That's something that we'll talk about later, is what to put in your system and what not to put in your system. So inside your septic tank, I hope nobody's eating right now, I apologize, but there are baffles and sometimes filters, depending. So septic tanks are equipped with baffles for the inlet and the outlet pipe. These baffles help to stop the transfer of solids. This is especially important for the outlet pipe so that scum does not transfer to the leaching bed and clog distribution lines. As of January 2007, all new septic tanks that are installed are to be equipped with an effluent filter in place of the outlet baffle, as per the Ontario Building Code regulations. These filters further protect the leaching bed from solids entering and increases the longevity of the system with proper maintenance. So the top picture there is of a effluent filter, which is quite commonly installed now. Some of the older filters that were installed were a bit smaller. They can come in many different colors, shapes, sizes. Now it's usually a 6-inch filter, whereas when the regulation first came out, it was only a 4-inch filter. People were noticing that these were clogging up faster. And definitely don't be alarmed if you open your tank and there is no filter, because if it was installed prior to 2007, it was not mandatory. And that's where you'll see the 2 bottom pictures. If you open up your tank, you'll either see a plastic baffle or a concrete baffle. So what happens with the baffles and the filters is, because of the bacteria and the fermentation that's happening inside your tank, on the outlet side is there will be a scum layer that forms on the top of the surface. And if these baffles aren't there, that scum will go straight out into your bed and it will plug it up over time. So that's where having somebody either check your system or getting regular pump outs, because we find with the concrete tanks that baffle is the first thing that rots and falls off. So if you neglect your tank and don't look at it for 10 years, there is a pretty high chance that that baffle may have fallen in and that you've actually been letting solids go out to your bed. So very important thing to have. Now, if you have a filter in your tank, proper maintenance of those is very important, because if they plug up solid, it can most certainly cause a sewage back up into either your home or the tank could overflow, which obviously would not be a very good thing. So leaching beds. So the effluent from the septic tank travels to the leaching bed either by gravity or from a pump, is equally distributed into the perforated lines, leaches into the gravel layer, and eventually into the sand layer. Once this process is completed, the polished water is released back into the environment. Now, this picture is of just a typical trench bed. There are so many different kinds of beds out there. You might not always have gravel. You might not always have perforated pipes. Each system is designed very differently, and that's where it's important to know what you have on your property so that you can understand how it works. Leaching beds come in many different shapes and sizes. Yours may be very different than your neighbor's. There are different types of leaching beds, which include trench beds, filter beds, type A and B beds, as well as shallow buried trench beds. It is important to remember that when your leaching bed was designed, it was designed for your property layout at the time. So if you plan to do any significant landscaping or add any buildings, driveways, anything like that, you should always consult a licensed septic specialist first, because these things without proper planning can severely hinder the function of your septic system. Then we move on to class 4 advanced treatment systems. So there are many different kinds again on the market, kind of like cars. You know, your opinion of one car might be why it's better. There's also different systems that, depending on the property, that they fit better, whichever works. So typically treatment systems take up less space compared to a conventional septic system, and in some areas have reduced setbacks due to a higher level of treatment. So there are lots of pros, smaller footprint, many different options to choose from depending on what is necessary on the property. In some areas like Blackstone Lake, a conventional system requires a minimum 30-meter setback to the high water mark, whereas a treatment system only requires a minimum of 15-meter setback. They're great for sites with difficult topography. Typically, less materials are required for a treatment system because there's already a certain amount of treatment that happens in the tanks or with whatever technology they're using. With these systems to be part of the Ontario Building Code and be allowed to be installed on your property, there is yearly servicing that is required, but this gives you peace of mind that your system is being maintained and functioning properly by having somebody look at it every single year. Some of the cons, of course, with technology comes a higher price tag sometimes. The requirement for the yearly maintenance does cost a fee, of course. Even if you can have a gravity system installed, some treatment systems still require pumps for dosing and use of hydro. So, you know, where you're typically maybe hoping not to use hydro or a whole lot of it, some of these systems, regardless, still need hydro for them to do their proper functions. That have had some homeowners that notice an odor depending on the treatment unit. Some of them are using air pumps to agitate the liquids inside tanks and whatnot. So some odors can be noticed depending on the system. So how to maintain your system. Septic systems are an expensive piece of infrastructure on your property. Protecting and maintaining them is key to avoiding costly repairs or damage to the environment. The first step in maintaining your system is knowing all of the components where they are on your property. Having knowledge of where your system is prevents you from parking on it, building a fire pit on it, planting trees on it, etc. So it is actually quite surprising the amount of people that own property that really have no idea where their system is. Especially we found through COVID, a lot of the real estate market, everything that happened so quickly that people weren't getting the info from the previous homeowners and stuff like that. And we've seen a lot of incidents over the last couple of years where people realized that they were parking on top of their septic bed, you know, parking on top of their septic tanks, or they've started developing and adding things to the properties without actually knowing where their system is. So you know, you got to think, if you had something else expensive on the property, you're going to be aware, you know, it's like your hydro line. If you're going to dig somewhere, you want to be aware of where it is before you ever dig. So it's the same way with your septic system, and having, you know, pools on top of them, fire pits, patios, anything like that. These systems need to be left alone, as they are very sensitive when it comes to weight or anything on top of them. So septic tank pumping, and now I know that this is a bit of a, everybody has their own opinions on when and how. There are some areas that have mandates that need to have their tanks pumped every so many years. For us in Parry Sound, we don't have anything by any of the townships or anything like that that are telling us when to pump. But the Ontario Building Code states that tanks must be pumped when the tank has accumulated 1/3 capacity of sludge. As a homeowner, this is obviously going to be very difficult to judge. So typically most homes pump anywhere from every 3 to 7 years. This is dependent on what goes into the system, however, the bacteria levels, how often it's used, and many other factors. So your pump truck operator can tell you whether you need to pump more frequently or not. If it has been a while, then you should definitely make the call. We hear quite often from people, I haven't had my tank pumped in 15 or 20 years, which, you know, we go to do the pump out and the tank is anywhere from 2/3 to almost 3/4 full of sludge. But it's not a matter of just having it pumped, it's also a matter of having it inspected. And that's where those baffles are important, the lids, the overall tank structure. Over time, concrete tanks do break down. We've seen issues with plastic tanks as well. You know, so having somebody looking at your system, and this way too, is if they go to pump your tank and the liquid levels are high, they can see that something might be going on with the bed, and they can figure out from there. So having the system maintained, very important. So we do have lots of important tips for septic beds. I can't actually read my top line because there's a bar in the way, but I believe the first line is about controlling your water use, which obviously is very important, because everything that you put down the drains in your house, whether it be your shower, your kitchen sink, your laundry sink, your washing machine, typically that's all going to your septic system. Now, some people do have gray water recycling, or they have separate gray water pits, but this is just generally speaking of your most common setup. So that's where spacing loads of laundry and showers out is, you know, super important to let your system rest. You've got to let those solids settle in your tank before they're going out to your bed. And so, you know, if you've gone away for a week and now you're doing 5-6 loads of laundry, one after the other, you have to think about how much water is being put into your system. And now, especially because once it goes out to your leaching bed, that water from your septic tank is relying on, you know, your leaching pipes with the gravel, the sand, and everything around it to do the proper treatment of that. So if you've now completely saturated your septic bed or your leaching bed, things probably are not going to be fully treated the way that they should be before they actually reach going back into the environment. So letting your system rest, whether it's, you know, even running the dishwasher over and over again, just stuff that you need to be mindful of. Your system is designed for your everyday use in the building, and not typically for big parties or family reunions. And a lot of people say, well, it's only one weekend, but it's not a matter of the weekend. It's the fact that your system was designed for a single day's use, and that's how they're sized. So if you had a, you know, a one bathroom, 3-bedroom home that's under 2,000 square feet, the way that your system is designed is for 6 people. So now all of a sudden, if you have 10 people over for the weekend, it's not designed to handle that, and proper treatment may not happen. So even though you're saying, well, my system was fine, you don't really know what's going on underground as far as the treatment of all the bacteria and everything in your leaching bed. Another important thing to make sure is that your downspouts are not draining into your leaching field. So some people, we have seen that they have flooded all their downspouts and just absolutely flooded the system out. Their tank's overflowing, it's backing up into the house. So definitely something to not have going into or onto, because if you've got your downspouts where they end right at your septic bed, and that's where all the water is being collected from your roofs, your eaves troughs and everything, you're now putting a whole bunch of water into the ground, which is going to make it difficult for your leaching field to accept everything that's coming from the rest of your house. Very important to not put pools, campfires, sheds, etc. on top of your leaching field or the mantle loading area. So when a septic system is designed now, according to Ontario Building Code regulations, there's a requirement for 15 meters or 50 feet of sand, which is a 25 centimeter sand layer that's actually at the bottom of your leaching field that extends out. So oftentimes we'll see people put a driveway or something like that in over this mantle area because people are only concerned of where their actual pipes are. But your pipes are doing the treatment, and what happens is once that water hits that mantle loading area at the bottom, that's what actually disperses the water and spreads it out. So if people are putting buildings, driveways on this area, you're now going to end up most likely with water mounting in the area and flood out your system because it doesn't know where to go. So again, that's where if you're going to construct something or alter the property, very important to know where all your components are. Now, this is a problem we're seeing right now with the snow melt. A lot of people think that piling the snow on top of their septic bed is a great idea, as far as being an insulation factor, anything like that. But now that we're getting our spring temperatures and the thaw, this is a copious amount of water that's going into your septic bed that should not be. So, you know, being mindful in the fall of, you know, planning ahead for winter and where you're going to pile your snow, definitely keep in mind of where your septic system is. Again, I can't read the top one, but I'm pretty sure it's about properly grooming your system. So this, you know, when we're talking about cutting your grass or cutting your weeds, whatever you got, but allowing your system to, you know, grow wild and free is not a great idea, because once you get little saplings and stuff that start to grow in there, some of these saplings eventually over time are going to turn into either larger bushes, larger trees, and that's where you can have root problems that affect your leaching pipes. So if you think about roots like to go towards water, what more perfect place than your leaching pipes? And that's can be a very costly mistake. So when it comes to planting trees or doing anything on your property, you really want to consider where you're putting all of your plants and everything, because they can certainly affect your system. Another thing to make sure is that your sump pump does not go to your septic system. Again, this is a copious amount of water that should not be going into your system, and it was not designed to handle that. Do not park on top of your leaching field. Quite often we always see boat trailers. You know, you've launched your boat for the summer and want to get the trailer out of the way, so let's put it on top of the septic system. Well, now you're creating pressure points and you're compacting soils by leaving something parked on top of there. Oftentimes we see, you know, guests, you're having guests over to your cottage, and maybe your septic area is not clearly marked, and you might only have one flat spot on your property, and that might be because that's where your leaching field is. So this obviously another thing that if you find that people tend to almost make the mistake on your, you know, parking on your septic system, either mark it, put a sign up, you know, put some driveway stakes, put something that people aren't going to make that costly mistake for you. If you have an effluent filter, it definitely needs to be cleaned annually. Now, some residents require more frequent cleaning of their filters depending on what's going into it. We always find that households that are not overly careful about what's going down their drains have to clean their filters even more. We also find households that have a lot of women in it with hair conditioner, those kind of products really get caught in the filter, which is great because it's not going out to your bed. But then we do notice that the effluent filters need to be cleaned more often. So oftentimes what we will recommend with a new system is that when you've got your daylight savings changes, so twice a year, that you're kind of checking until you get familiar with your system to know, okay, I cleaned it in March, so I checked again in the fall and there was barely anything on it. I can check again next year in March and I might be good for a year. Now there's some people, again, like I said, they're every couple months cleaning their filters just because they're not overly careful what's going down. Or sometimes there is a bad, that there's not enough bacteria happening in the septic tank that will actually create more solids in that scum layer that get caught in the filter. So if you don't have a filter and you would like to install a filter, that's something that a septic professional can definitely do for you. We always recommend them because anything that you can do to prevent any issues from happening and to maintain your system, then why not? Now, typically, if you're cutting your grass, you're already in your leaching field area, but we always recommend walking your leaching field area occasionally to ensure that there's no slumping of soil, wet areas, excessive grass growth, or odors. So oftentimes we'll get comments from people, it's 30 degrees out in July, we've had a really hot, dry year, and they'll say, I've got 4 really, really green lines in my septic area. That's great. It means it's working properly. Well, not really. If you do see this, it can mean a couple different things. So it's not, don't jump to conclusions that your system is completely failing, but oftentimes this means that water is traveling up to the surface. It might not be breaking out on the surface and creating any ponding or anything, but this could mean that, at some point in time, you might be looking at replacing your system, because what happens when we see this water start to travel up to the surface, it means that the gravel and the biomat has built up underneath either your pipes or your leaching chambers, whichever you have in the ground. So it's always good just to keep an eye on things. Sometimes we will see where your distribution box is, that you'll get ponding on top of the surface. This happens sometimes when your septic bed is plugged up. So just keeping an eye on anywhere that has wet areas, anything like that, always pay attention to. And especially, it's good to walk the system, I would say at least a couple times a year, and just to familiarize, that, okay, that looks a little different than it did a couple months ago. Certainly if you have what we call a raised bed, which we see quite a bit up here. If you've got a raised bed and you see one of the side slopes starting to almost look like it's sliding or anything like that, chances are that that could mean that your system's got some serious issues going on, and to definitely call a septic professional. So this is a picture taken inside of leaching bed pipes. Proper grooming of the leaching bed is important. Maintain only shallow rooted vegetation and keep mature trees from growing. Keep them away from your system. Leaching bed pipes filled with roots can cause a blockage over time. So, typically we will see roots in a system that haven't completely blocked the pipes up yet, but over time they can create a mat in there that will completely stop the water. So, if you put a new bed in, being mindful of where you're planting new trees or new gardens, anything like that is super important, because it could be a very costly mistake. So what not to put down your drains. And now this is a big thing that some people are very conscious of. Some people are kind of on the fence, they try to pay attention once in a while, and other people just don't know or don't care, not sure. But this is where the education comes in of what can and can't go down there. Especially we see a lot of people that are used to town sewers. People are renting out cottages, or they've got family members up that they don't know. So we always recommend putting signs up as well. If it's a cottage that, you know, it's a family cottage that some people might be using it one weekend, some might be using it another. Always good to put signs up for guests, just then you know that you've got peace of mind that even though you're controlling what you put down, that other people that are using the building are controlling as well. So grease and fats are a very big thing that's important not to put down. These are things that don't break down very well. And oftentimes we'll hear people say, well, I dumped out, you know, all my bacon grease, and so we always control it. But going that one step further and actually wiping your cooking pans out before washing them, because if you think about over, say, 5 years that you haven't got a pump out, how many times you've cooked foods where you may have dumped it out, but you didn't wipe it out. Now you're washing your dishes, of how much grease that can actually accumulate over time. Same thing with food scraps, having a garburator, or just making sure that you clean your plate off really well before you wash it, or that you at least catch those scraps before they go down your sink. These things don't break down overly quickly either. Baking supplies like flour. I'm sure if you've ever, you know, made something and let the flour stick to the bowl after and went to wash it, how hard that is to get off. Now imagine that inside your plumbing, inside your line going to your septic tank itself, or possibly going out to your leaching field. It's almost like a concrete that can be formed in there. You want to be very mindful of excessive amounts of bleach, heavy cleaners, and antibacterial soap. Especially with COVID, we noticed this was obviously everybody's using antibacterial everything. Now, using a little bit of cleaners or bleach or anything like that, completely, you know, acceptable. We've all got to clean stuff, but putting large amounts of it and large amounts down quite frequently can severely disturb the bacteria that's happening inside your system. Copious amounts of hair conditioner and fabric softener. Again, these are things that can clog your filters, or if you've just got baffles, these are things that can go out into your bed and over time do create almost like a slime inside your leaching bed, which over time can plug things up. Paints and thinners. You know, oftentimes we hear people say, well, I didn't dump any paint down there, but if you washed your paintbrush in the sink, all that water is going down to your system. And this we usually notice right away when we open up a septic tank because it's a different color. You know, they might have just painted their living room red, and you can instantly tell that somebody's either washed paintbrushes or the dishes, whichever. Oftentimes we find a lot of paper towel, condoms, feminine products inside septic tanks. Definitely not the place for them. They don't break down by any means. The other issue with this that we see is when people have pumps, say that you know, your septic tank is at the top of the hill, your house is at the bottom, and somebody's flushed something down and now it's got to go through that pump to get up. Well, now you've just jammed up, or possibly jammed up, a very expensive pump because of something that was put down there that should have been. Expired or unused medications should not be dumped down the toilet. You never know what those medications can have the effect on your bacteria in your system for. So it's always good to bring those back to either a pharmacy or different places have the medication drop-offs. Coffee grounds, don't ever dump those down. They take a very long time to break down, same thing. They can also settle in your pipes on the way to your system, so you could be asking for a backup. Foreign objects, we see a lot of really weird stuff come out of septic tanks, some things that we have no idea how they got there. Sometimes kids can flush something, which obviously is beyond your control, but having signs up, you know, just for people that don't know is very helpful. The biggest trend that we're seeing an issue with is baby and feminine wipes. A lot of the packaging says right on them that they are flushable. Just because something is flushable does not mean that it breaks down. When you look at those wipes, you know, next time you go to use one, see how easy it is to tear apart, because it's really not that easy. So if you think about how long some people use these for, if you were to say use them every day over a 5-year span, what that could look like inside your septic tank. And it can block, you could have a backup before it even gets to your septic tank. But we've also seen where they're so bad inside septic tanks that it's taking hours to even try to pump them out, but they are definitely hurting the function of your septic system because they're not breaking down. So this is a picture of why it is so important to be careful what you put into your septic system. This picture is of grease buildup over time in the main line to the septic tank. So this was a person that was not aware that the baking grease, stuff like that, shouldn't go down the sinks. So not to scare you if you haven't been wiping your pans out, but just this is something that is not easy to get out. So this is something we ended up having to dig up the whole system, like from the line going from the house to the tank to be able to replace, because it was not something that we could just pull out. Camera inspections of leaching beds. So if you have concerns over your system, you know, you've got a funky smell or it hasn't been checked in a while, whichever, camera inspections do show us how well a bed is functioning, but can also show us why it may be malfunctioning. So the camera inspection allows us to take a deeper look inside and not make costly mistakes with a misdiagnosis. You know, if your whole system's backing up, it could be as simple as there being a blockage in a pipe leading from the septic tank to the leaching bed. You know, could be a simple fix rather than replacing the whole system. So technology has come a long way, lets us see a lot more in the system of what's going on. And this way too, if you're looking for peace of mind, you're just not sure how well your bed's functioning, this is another aspect that you can use to tell your system's health. And that's the presentation. I'm sure there will be many questions.
Thanks so much, Danielle. We did have a few questions submitted in advance, and we've got a few that have popped up recently. So we'll get to a few of them. We might need to move on to the next presentation before we can get through all of them. But either if Danielle's able to stick around, by no means do you have to, Danielle, but we also have your contact information right here. So if there's anything that we don't get around to, folks can either follow up directly with Danielle or we can provide some of those answers in the follow-up materials. But I'll start with one of the questions that was asked in advance, and that refers to a household that uses composting toilets and a class 2 septic gray water. Just wondering about tips to keep it in shape.
So composting toilets are kind of like cars. Each different kind of car requires a different kind of maintenance. So very important that if you are buying either a new composting toilet or you've just bought a place, that you find the owner's manual of what exactly needs to get done to it. So I can't really speak on that portion because each system is different when it comes to that. But the biggest thing is that you're not flooding your composting system out. So they are designed to only handle a certain amount of liquid, same thing with a septic, but a composting toilet is much less unforgiving because that is inside your building. And if you flood that out, it's probably not going to be a very good weekend at the cottage. As far as gray water pits, this is same thing. It's very important to control what's going down your sinks. If you're washing food scraps down, all that kind of stuff, you can easily plug your gray water system up. Now, when a new system is designed, they are supposed to have an access hatch that you can clean them out. But a lot of the older systems, people don't even know where they are in the property, or they just go into a gravel pit. So they don't really have the ability to clean them out. So just watching what goes down your drains is the #1 key factor for maintaining that.
Great. And a couple kind of related questions that were also asked in advance. So I'll pair those two together. So the first is, how many years should a septic tank last? And how can one typically tell a septic is soon going to need replacing?
So saying how long a septic tank should last is a very difficult thing to answer. Again, just like a car, the more you maintain it, the more you change the oil, you know, all that kind of stuff goes into how long a system is going to last. Whether you've got a concrete tank or a plastic tank, whether you park on top of it. All of those things go into that. There are now tanks that have lifetime warranties, stuff like that on them. A concrete tank will not last forever. It will break down at some point, but that's all kind of part of the process. Typically for a complete septic system, 20 years is usually somewhere that you want to aim to at least get out of a system. We see systems that are 50-year-old that are functioning fantastic. The tanks are still in great shape, but this is where having the proper care and maintenance and having them inspected. So there's different signs and symptoms of your system, maybe going on the fritz and that you're going to need to replace it soon. And again, that's seeing, water breaking out to the surface, seeing some really green lines in your yard, very foul odors, stuff like that. But if you've got someone that's coming to do system maintenance every couple of years, then you'll be able to tell when you might be in the need for a new system.
That makes sense. Okay, great. At this time, I think we'll move on to our next presentation, just so we don't run past noon. But if we have time and we're able to, we'll circle back to these other questions if you're able to stay with us, Danielle. Otherwise, we'll follow up in an email.
Yep,
so thanks so much again. And I'm going to now turn it over to Ben John, Energy and Emissions Specialist.
Thanks, Katrina. I will just share my screen here.
That's good.
Is everyone able to see that? Yep.
That's perfect.
Wonderful. Well, hello, everyone. As Katrina mentioned, my name is Ben John, and I am an energy and emissions specialist. I'm actually calling out from British Columbia this morning. I moved out here in 2020 to continue working in the energy and emissions field, but I do still have family in McDougall and Parry Sound. So I'm thankful for this opportunity to be able to share some of my knowledge for the benefit of the biosphere region and beyond as well. Basically, what my role entails as an energy and emissions specialist is that I support businesses, residents, and local governments strategize and implement a variety of fuel switching or energy saving initiatives that reduce energy consumption and will in turn save them money as well as reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of my work out here lately has actually been on the transition to electric vehicles, but I always have a number of different projects related to building efficiency as well. So for the purposes of today's presentation, I'll be sharing some ways in which you can save energy in your homes and reduce energy costs at the same time. But I'm actually, for this presentation, I'm going to be taking what I think is a bit of a different approach in this, because I'm sure we've all heard, a million times that we should be doing things like turning off our lights when they're not in use, for example. So instead, again, I'll just be taking a bit of a step back and going over these strategies and the things that we need to be thinking about before we even start taking action. And through this, I'm hoping to demonstrate that, there's each and every one of us can achieve meaningful energy and cost savings. And because of this, we can all have the ability to contribute to reducing our emissions within our own means. I don't think it's a secret that some of the common energy saving practices we often hear about can cost a lot of money up front to do. And so through this presentation too, I want to recognize that these expensive upgrades aren't possible for everyone. So we'll be strategizing and thinking about how can we achieve cost savings while being aware and cautious of the constraints that some households might face. So for a bit of agenda, I'm going to just quickly start by going over why reducing energy is important, including the obvious fact that if by saving energy, we can save money on our utility bills as well. From here, I'll then share 3 strategies or approaches for you to consider and how you might want to go about reducing your energy consumption, as well as a sort of a framework to assess these approaches and understand where you might be able to save money based on the approach that is the best fit for you and your household. And finally, I'll conclude with sharing a few ways in which you can start with these processes. So diving into why this is important, I think it's important to recognize that we all pay a lot for money, for energy, a lot of money for energy every single year. In fact, the annual median household expenditure for home energy is roughly $3,600 a year in the region. And now that's obviously quite a bit of money. And keep in mind that that's just for our homes too. The money that we're spending to put fuel in our vehicles, for example, would be additional to this amount. And with the way that gas prices have been lately, it paints a pretty clear picture that we do spend quite a bit of money on energy in a given year. So being able to reduce how much we're consuming, even just a little bit, can go a long way in saving you money. Saving money on energy, it also has a deeper meaning for our region as well from a social perspective. Recognizing how much households spend on energy in a year, there's a growing field of work which is investigating the prevalence of what is called energy poverty in Canada. There's no formal definition for energy poverty, but there's sort of a general agreement that a household is considered to be in energy poverty when it spends more than 6% of its after-tax household income on its home's energy. Within our region, within the Parry Sound region anyways, there are higher rates of energy poverty in comparison to other areas in the province and country. And this is just a trend that we see more often in rural communities than in comparison to urban centers. And there's a number of reasons for this, but that's a whole presentation in itself. But in the region anyways, 26% of households are spending more than 10% of their after-tax household income on their home's energy, and 12% of households are spending 15% or more of their after-tax household income on energy. So again, every bit of savings that can be achieved, whether it's big or small, can have a huge positive impact. Reducing energy is also important because it can reduce the impacts that utility companies experience in delivering this energy to you. And by reducing those impacts, it can actually have benefits to yourself as well. So if we're using electricity, for example, I often receive questions and maybe some confusion about how the narrative about reducing your emissions and energy use can have mixed messaging sometimes. So for example, on one hand, we're looking to say reduce the amount of electricity we're using, but at the same time, we're promoting things like fuel switching to heat pumps in electric vehicles, which is going to increase the amount of electricity we use. And the way to think about this is that there's a limited amount of electricity that can be supplied at any one time. And as we build more buildings and are transitioning to, say, electric vehicles, for example, it's putting more demand on the grid until at some point that demand exceeds what can be supplied, and it's triggering expensive infrastructure upgrades, and the costs of which are often trickling down to us as the consumers. So by reducing energy consumption at the same time as some of these fuel switching initiatives, we can sort of chip away at some of those demand increases. We decrease a little bit in one area, but are increasing in a little bit somewhere else, so that the net effect is such that those infrastructure upgrades are delayed or potentially not even needed, and that cascade of costs essentially doesn't fall down to the consumers as quickly. And lastly, by reducing our energy consumption, we also reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. In the biosphere region, roughly 18% of community greenhouse gas emissions are coming from residential buildings. So each and every one of our actions can go a long way in tackling climate change. Making a connection to my last point as well, by taking action on the energy and greenhouse gas emissions from our homes, there's going to be spillover effects to other emission sectors as well. So again, by reducing electrical demand on the grid, for example, we're freeing up electrical capacity for some of those fuel switching things, such as, again, electric vehicles and electric heat pumps, which are going to reduce emissions further. When it comes to strategizing how to reduce energy consumption, there are three general approaches that can be taken. And all of these, all the different actions that we might consider or might want to take can be essentially placed under these categories. I'm sure we've all more or less heard of these approaches before, but I think it's important to see them listed out separately as well to understand that each approach requires something a little bit different of us and also requires a different level of effort as well. So very briefly, we'll go over energy conservation, energy efficiency, and fuel switching. And I imagine that we're quite familiar with each of these approaches, so I apologize if this isn't anything necessarily new. But again, I think it's important to make sure we're all on the same page for when we get to that framework and assessing where we might be able to, or where you might be able to save energy within your own household. Starting with energy conservation is essentially making an effort to reduce the amount of energy we are using by using less of an energy service. And this is primarily achieved through behavioral change. The phrase energy service is really just jargon for referring to the products and appliances we use that are consuming energy, like light bulbs, microwaves, stoves, potentially, and so on. So really what this is saying is that we're changing the ways in which we use our appliances or reducing the frequency in which we use them as a way to conserve energy. This also includes the classic example of, turning the lights off when you're not in the room. There are also a lot of studies that show that up to 10% of your monthly electricity comes from what is called phantom power or phantom load, which are those lights or screens that are running in the background on your printer, your TV, or your coffee maker, for example, when they're not in use. So unplugging these devices rather than just turning them off, you can actually achieve additional energy and cost savings. There's also some less common examples that we don't hear about for this, like using the proper size burner on the stove when you're cooking, or slightly increasing the temperature of your fridge or freezer while maintaining safe food integrity. But in the end, these behavioral changes are considered to be a low or no cost solution to reducing energy and saving money. Energy efficiency is perhaps the phrase I think we might often hear the most. And what it refers to is using less energy to perform the same task. Now, unlike energy conservation, this is assuming that no behavioral change is taking place, and the energy cost savings is coming purely from a technology or a product that's performing better, or for a lack of better words, more efficiently. Again, with lighting, this could be something like purchasing CFL or LED lights instead of conventional halogen or incandescent lighting. Similarly, you have Energy Star appliances. They're able to operate on less energy to complete the same task in comparison to their conventional counterparts. Energy efficiency can also come from using technology or retrofits to optimize the performance of your home's heating and cooling systems. So for example, upgrading your weather stripping or insulation to better retain heat in your home, so your furnace doesn't have to work as hard to maintain that temperature that you set it at. Overall, though, there are really many different ways you can go about improving energy efficiency, and each one is going to have some sort of a cost associated with it. What that cost is really going to depend on what that action is that you're taking, your home's characteristics that may influence the performance of, again, say your heating and cooling systems. I also want to mention that even though energy efficiency doesn't require a behavioral change, being aware of your energy consuming habits is still extremely important in seeing the results that you want to see through this. Sometimes we can get into the trap where we know that because we're saving energy through efficiency, we actually end up using an energy service more. And this is dangerous because at some point, if you use that energy service more, you can actually end up using more energy than before, and it would essentially increase your bill. On the other hand, if you start mixing efficiency with conservation and you're using an energy efficient product less, you can amplify the impacts and you can achieve even greater cost savings. The last approach to consider is fuel switching. And like the name sounds, you're really just using a different fuel source to power one of those systems or products in your house. Often this strategy kind of goes hand in hand with electrification, where we're moving from products and systems that are using fossil fuels to ones that are using electricity as a fuel source. A good example of this is switching from a natural gas stove to, say, an electric stove, or installing an electric heat pump in replacement of a natural gas, propane, or oil furnace. In comparison to the other strategies, though, fuel switching is often going to be the most expensive, and because of this, it's often going to have the longest payback period as well. However, through this strategy, you can achieve some pretty significant cost savings. When it comes to assessing which strategy is right for you, there is a lot to think about. And the first is, how much is this going to cost me? As we move from conservation to fuel switching, generally speaking, the upfront costs are going to increase. Conservation initiatives, as I mentioned, are a solution that have no upfront cost, and efficiency and fuel switching can range from hundreds of dollars or tens of dollars to perhaps tens of thousands of dollars, depending on what project you're looking at doing. That said, as these costs increase, there's often greater grant funding that you can access to help reduce the cost burden of these. Different levels of government, for example, have grants that you can access, like the Canada Greeners Homes Grant, and even utility companies will have grants available to help with some of these fuel switching and efficiency type projects. As you can imagine too, that as we're moving from left to right here, the complexity of these strategies are going to increase as well, which is going to require more time and effort for you to carry out. Using the proper size burner or turning off lights is something that you can do tonight and see some benefits on your next bill, whereas installing a heat pump, that process may take many months. And it's also going to take some time to complete the paperwork for accessing grants if you decide to go that route as well. So we really need to ask ourselves when you're going about this, what can I budget for in these projects, and how much time do I have to dedicate to seeing this through? You know, our lives and our schedules are all quite different, so these are really only questions that you can answer for yourself. And finally, it's also wise to think about the impact that your actions are having. Depending on the level of effort you give, will also reflect on the benefits that you see in return. So for example, if you're simply just the only action that you're taking is to turn the lights off when you're not in use, you won't see, you know, much savings in return. However, as I mentioned, if you begin to mix multiple conservation efforts and even begin to mix some efficiency efforts in there as well, you could have quite a large impact. So even if you don't have, you know, a lot of money to undergo very expensive retrofits, there's really still a lot of opportunity for you to achieve a considerable cost savings on your energy. Another good way to evaluate the different costs, the level of effort needed and possible benefits, is to, you know, critically reflect on how you're using energy as well as your habits. Going through your daily routine and really being mindful of how you're using your energy can help in identifying some great places to start. I'd also suggest looking into some of these strategies in a bit more detail to have a full list of actions that you may be able to take. With this information and by critically reflecting on your habits, you can just simply take a walk around your house as well, and you might be surprised by what you can find. To provide a little bit of a personal example here, when I moved out to BC from McDougall, I did exactly that. I reflected on how I was using energy and the different ways to conserve it, and looked for opportunities that I could improve efficiency within my apartment as well. And through these efforts, that my electrical bills now are totaling only $20 to $25 a month, which is down from roughly $35 a month. And that's including my heating as well, since the apartment that I'm in is running on electric baseboard heating. So over the course, though, over the course of a year, I'm saving effectively around $120 to $150 for mostly just changing my habits. Of course, I realize that there's different rate structures between utility companies and provinces, and a different climate out here as well. But the point being is that I've been able to shave quite a significant portion off my energy costs with very minimal investment, and you have similar opportunities available to you as well. If you're looking for larger returns, though, and are considering some of those more costly retrofits or fuel switching initiatives, I would highly recommend consulting with an energy advisor. An energy advisor will conduct a home consultation, and using a number of different tests, like a blower door test or thermal imaging, they'll be able to identify the actions that will basically get you the most bang for your buck. Whether it's upgraded insulation or improved weather stripping or whatever. So through the Canada Greener Homes grant, I understand that there's money available for the cost of consulting with an energy advisor as well, provided you proceed with implementing at least one of their recommended retrofits. They'll also be able to support you in identifying and exploring grants that you may be eligible for carrying out some of these retrofit projects. So again, I really encourage you to look into the Canada Greener Homes grant if that's something you're interested in. But in conclusion, there are three main things that I hope you can take away from this very quick presentation. The first is that everyone can experience cost savings on their energy bills. It doesn't matter if you don't have funds to pursue expensive retrofits. There are actions we can all take that result in meaningful energy and cost savings. And in turn, this means that we can all have a positive influence on addressing climate change. The second is that some actions are going to require more time and effort, and that's okay. Beginning this journey with clear expectations and understanding what you're getting yourself into is going to be key in keeping you motivated to continue. It's important too to remember that, for example, weather can influence how much energy we're using on a given month. Extremely cold weather, for example, can increase our energy use as we're trying to keep our homes warmer. So don't be discouraged by perhaps any monthly gains that you might see. It's important to look at this from a long-term perspective to see those results that you're looking for. And because of this is something that's going to take time, which is also somewhat connected to my last point as well too, that if you want to continue seeing energy savings over the course of many, many years, you're going to need to make a bit of a commitment to it. You need to continue to critically reflect on your habits and always ask yourself, is there something that I can do to improve on what I'm doing? And giving yourself this mindset will help experience larger cost savings down the road. So with that, I appreciate your time, and I hope you found this different approach to this conversation refreshing and helpful. I apologize that it was very, very quick, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them now.
Thanks so much, Ben. That was fantastic. I do just want to draw people's attention to, I believe, as attendees, you can see in the Q&A box, I think you can see where questions have been answered. So I wanted to flag that if you asked a question and you didn't hear it asked following the presenter's presentation, there's a good chance that it was answered, an answer was typed up and responded that way. So feel free to have a look through those answered questions to see if there's any information you missed. So we did have one question coming in advance relating to this topic. I do think that your presentation did a fantastic job of answering it, but I'll still ask it one more time in case there's any key points you want to just highlight again. So that question was, how can one figure out their dwelling's biggest opportunities for becoming more energy efficient?
Yeah, that's a good question. The best place to start with that, I would say, is to consult with an energy advisor. Really, some of the tests that they do are going to identify exactly those projects or upgrades that you can do to save the most energy and find the greatest cost savings based specifically on your home's unique characteristics. So one test that they may do, for example, is a thermal imaging test. And this test will essentially show where in your house that heat is escaping, and when, as well too, where that heat should not be escaping. So, you know, maybe you can, through this this test, you'll see that you're losing heat through your attic, and that could be a sign that your best course of action is to upgrade the insulation within your attic. You know, conversely, maybe that test is going to show that you're losing a lot of heat around your windows or perhaps your door. You've got a lot of drafting coming into your home, so perhaps you need to you know, do some upgrade your ceiling or replace your ceiling as well as your weather stripping. So consulting with an energy advisor, I would say, is definitely the best place to start in identifying where you can find those projects that'll save you the most money, if you're considering efficiency and for example.
Right. Yeah, and I can speak from experience. I have signed up for the Canada Greener Homes grant and have reached the stage now where we've had our home energy audit and received a report, and that report highlights a number of different areas where we can make improvements. And as long as you complete something that is listed within your report, some sort of changes that are recommended, then the grant applies to you. And yeah, so that's an opportunity that's still available for folks who are interested. So we just got another question here. We have a furnace and water heater on oil that are almost 30 years old. We are considering changing to electric rather than the propane that many surrounding properties use. We would appreciate your ideas on the best fuel source to switch to in this area of Granite Rock, Honey Harbor.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I will also recommend discussing with an energy advisor about that as well too, because they'll be able to really give you that full detailed report on how that system is going to perform in your given scenario. I will say though that you know, electric heat pumps are a good alternative to fuel oil. There are some, you know, I will mention that there are some challenges that have been experienced with some of the cold weather that can happen within our region, but heat pump technology is improving, and that's becoming less of a concern as well. The other thing too that I didn't mention in terms of the fuel switching is that you can actually also decrease your insurance costs, your home insurance costs, by switching away from a fuel oil system towards something like an electric system. So that can also achieve you additional cost savings as well. So again, I unfortunately won't be able to answer to your specific scenario, but would recommend discussing with an energy advisor and perhaps even going through that Canada Greener Homes grant, because again, you can access some grant funding for that consultation and really get a detailed report into your specific scenario.
Great. Another question here. I currently have a propane furnace which heats water for radiators and hot water on demand for home use. Is there any way to change over to a heat pump without having to change my radiators and hot water heating system? These are only 7 years old and the house has been retrofitted with insulation and new windows with high quality energy loss prevention.
That is a good question as well. To be honest, I would recommend, again, consulting with an energy advisor on that scenario. I do less of the actual installations myself. I more help with the strategizing and helping with grant funding. So I don't want to say one way or another, because again, there might be some unique opportunities within your system that You could possibly retain some of those existing systems, but it's a possibility that you might have to change some of those over as well.
That's fair. Thanks. All right. Not seeing any more questions here, but I'll give it just a moment while I switch over to our final screen. So there we are. All wrapped up with questions. If anybody has questions that they think of at a later time, feel free to get in touch and we'll do our best to get those responses for you. But for now, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who participated today. It's great to see such a committed group of people joining us on their weekend, and a huge thank you to our presenters. Your knowledge and expertise on these topic areas is so appreciated. It's really made this event fantastic. So again, we will be providing a follow-up email to everybody who registered. That will include the link to this recording, all the resources that were mentioned throughout the morning, and some links to some previous presentations as well on some of these topics that are a bit longer and go into a bit more detail as well. A reminder again, the Life on the Bay guide is available for download, free download on our website. You can download the full document or section by section based on your needs. And if there are any further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Thanks again. We really appreciate you joining us this morning.